The story of Romania's economic growth starts with a trial and an execution. Typically, a drumhead trial for the statesperson of a major Eastern European country comes with many bad tidings. But for Romania, the trial and the execution of General Secretary Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Elena opened up doors of economic prosperity. Years later, Romania was an economic model for post-communist states in Eastern Europe. From a mere GDP of under 50 billion USD in 1989 communist era to almost 300 billion in the 2021 democratic era, Romania has shown tremendous growth. Romania's revolutionary economic journey from 1987, when its GDP per capita stood at $1,659, to 2021, when it reached $14,927, can only be accredited to the perseverance of its citizens. So, what were the factors behind this phenomenal economic rise? How did a nation with a staunch communist party get back on its feet? How did Romania become the success story we know today? Let's break it down. Romania's growth story starts from the 1980s, when the nation was sleeping hungry and waking up with no food. Despite a major communist push from the Soviet Union, the country's ruling party had failed to implement major economic reforms. Under the rule of the Romanian Communist Party, of PCR, the Ceausescu had taken major policy shifts that left the state with no money whatsoever. Romania was being crushed under foreign debt that could only be paid through strict austerity measures. In the 1980s, the Ceausescu had stopped investing in social welfare altogether. Romania's major social sectors, like healthcare, education, gender equality, and youth development programs, were severely underfunded. Since the PCR had responded to major energy demand from the industrial sector, average citizens lived through pitch-black darkness for most of the day. Macro policies were a colossal failure, and the country's GDP growth was negative, while in 1982 inflation in the country was at an all-time high. At the same time, the country's reserves were almost empty. If that wasn't enough, the government was extremely unpopular after it rolled out the austerity programs of 1981. Instantly, poverty had become a widespread problem for Romania. At the same time, the state used newspapers and other forms of media to report socialism as a way of the free, independent development of the peoples. But the reality couldn't be more different. For the most part, the PCR was successful in paying off most of its foreign loans. Yet, at what cost? The year 1989 was monumental for Romania, just like it was for most of Eastern Europe. As the Soviet Union walked towards its end, the reign of Ceausescu also had a turbulent end. In the aftermath of the PCR's explosive austerity measures, people protested violently. The city of Timisoara erupted into countrywide protests. Romanians wanted Nicolae and Elena to pay for the lives that had been lost to political dissent and economic damage in the country. The process was quick and decisive, and the Ceausescus were found guilty. Things only took a more interesting turn from here. Of course, the end of communist rule in Romania didn't mean that the economy was fixed magically. We want you to picture Romania in 1989 for a second. The government was in shambles, while the country struggled to democratize. Households were only allowed a few hours of electricity and heating, and the country's overall consumption of consumer goods was pretty low. Not to mention, the caretaker government was also trying to erase a complicated history of socialist reforms to design a new free market economy. Needless to say, the government didn't know what it was doing. Before the Romanian Revolution, the state had owned all means of production, including food and consumer goods. It was desperately trying to gauge private ownership in Romania. And that wasn't an easy task. The post-colonial hangover in the country didn't seem to go away. For 42 years, the state had centrally planned everything, from wages to the output flow, and everything was under the PRC. But then, after that, people were at the forefront of everything. Naturally, the economy wasn't performing well, and many factories had to be shut down. People lost their jobs every single day. In 1990, the GDP per capita was $1,227, compared to $1,567 in 1989. For once, the workforce in the country was being pushed to obey their bosses instead of the government. Many Romanians found that particularly hard. People had grown anti-communist in the aftermath of the trial, and they weren't exactly keen about working with bosses with communist sympathies and past. In that scenario, the provisional government in Romania couldn't achieve the industrial proficiency it had required. Since people were extremely poor, they knew their local demand for products wouldn't boost. So, torn between keeping people in factories and producing more jobs, the government was desperate for wealthy individuals to come through. But first things first, Romania was going through a severe food crisis that required the country to rely heavily on food imports. By giving land back to the farmers, the government was hoping for a miracle. Yet, progress was extremely slow. Farmers were still grappling with their new reality, and the government was waiting for them to feed the entire country. It doesn't take a genius to see why Romania was perhaps way too ambitious with its free market policies. In the years following the revolution of 1989, the average middle-class income was $60 per month. People had no money to spend or food to eat. Things were dire, and it was only when Romania joined hands with the EU that the move turned out to be an economic game-changer. Romania was desperate for foreign direct investment and an open trade agreement. The country's socialist past had isolated it from the rest of Europe for decades. One of the most crucial steps in Romania's economic recovery was for it to join the New World Order, and it was only possible if the country had ties with the western part of Europe through the European Union. Even though Romania's EU membership became formal in 2007, the country had already become super lucrative for Western businesses. But it didn't happen overnight either. Until 2000, the Romanian economy didn't attract any foreign direct investment from its neighboring countries, and there's a very good reason for that. You see, Romania had gained independence alongside its sister Soviet states. The fall of the USSR had created an alternative counterforce in the region in the name of the Russian Federation. A quick glimpse into the history would show you that Moscow had acquired the Soviet nuclear legacy, and while most of Eastern Europe was eager to value democracy and free markets, Russia resisted such ideals. Nevertheless, it was a force to be reckoned with. At the same time, Romania also wanted to send a message that its newly democratic government is pro-West. The message only became loud and clear when the country showed interest in obtaining membership in the US-led military alliance, NATO. Before attracting business through the EU, Romania wanted the world to see that it was a safe country. And what better way to achieve military securitization than to join the most expensive military alliance in the world, right? Romania's NATO membership was finalized in 2004, and that opened up new horizons in the country for FDIs and lucrative businesses. The country's EU membership kick-started Romania's very own free movement. Since the attractive membership came with certain terms and conditions, the government was eager to train and educate its workforce. For the first time, Romanians were free to move within Europe. People traveled across Europe to learn the old ways of managing free market economies, price liberalization, and striking bilateral trade agreements. Freedom of information allowed private business owners to learn from proficient businesses in Europe. The education sector responded to the newly founded demands too. Romanians were quick to figure out what their modern industry needed and were able to structure their education accordingly. Yet, Romania stands at the precipice of a complete paradox. However, Romania still stands as one of the EU's poorest countries, and NATO isn't exactly fond of its less-than-reliable government. For a progressive Europe, the human rights situation in Romania falls extremely short. Despite these big issues, Romania's Economic Complexity Index, or ECI, is pretty high. To keep it simple and short, the index is a measure of how diverse and sophisticated a country's exports are. By ECI's account, Romania's economy is the 19th most complex economy in the world. By 2000, the country was ranked 39th, and it has been going uphill ever since. So far, Romania's economic model has been pretty simple. It has found a delicate balance between keeping up with expensive imports like crude oil, but has managed to roll out local products for the world too. From automobiles to insulated wires, Romania has a wide array of exports that it has stabilized over the years. Within the European Union, it has earned its reputation for supplying food-based exports to Central and Western Europe. For example, Germany is Romania's top buyer when it comes to wheat and sunflower seeds. Other than its ties to Berlin, the Romanian coalition government has maintained trade ties with France, Poland, Italy and Hungary too. Its economic prosperity is quite shocking, and there's a reason why Romania, for many economists, is a huge paradox. To understand why, we need to take a closer look at the country's political institutions that are still stuck in their communist past. The governments are weak and unstable, while politicians are still learning the ropes of accountability. You see, corruption is rampant in Romania, and if politicians care about something, it is to deprive citizens of their basic human rights. Until 1989, the annual population growth rate was around 0.4%. After 1989, the trend changed downward, and the annual growth rate has remained negative till 2021. After the year 2021, we can see a drastic increase in population growth rate from negative 0.58% to 1.19%. This is because the Romanian government has established new laws to stimulate population growth, such as awarding bonuses to families with more children and taxing childless couples, restricting abortions and divorces, etc. The Romanian government imposes these laws to gain a workforce which is needed for the country to sustain economic growth. The emigration of young and skilled workers to developed neighborhoods is a grieving issue for the country. Talented Romanians are often leaving the country for a job in the Western EU, which offers a corruption-free and safe environment. In 2012, the country's political crisis hit the deep end when then Prime Minister Victor Ponta staged a de facto coup against then-President Traian Băsescu. The result of the constitutional crisis was a coalition government between the left Social Democratic Party and the right-wing National Liberal Party. Perhaps it was a miracle, but the coalition was successful in navigating the tough COVID situation and the war in Ukraine. The government acted very swiftly to protect the economy from the turmoil of the pandemic. In 2020, it rolled out a stimulus package of 4.4% of its GDP, and also helped the private sector stay afloat. Romania was one of the few EU economies that saw an unprecedented growth rate of 7% in 2021. And in the same year, its GDP per capita hit a new high of $14,927. Today, Romania's pro-Ukraine stance also gives it a protective measure against anti-Russian sanctions. While the country still suffers through major governance issues and human rights abuses, its connection with the EU has put it on a pedestal. Other than making economic strides, grassroots social movements in Romania promise a bright future for the youth. On a more positive front, Romania holds the distinction of achieving one of the highest levels of economic growth in the EU. Despite the hardship dealt by the COVID-19 pandemic, it has managed to keep its unemployment rate well below the 2022 EU average. And do you know which capital is ranked at the very top when it comes to startup ecosystems in the Balkans? It's none other than Romania's capital, Bucharest. Where do you think Romania is headed on the economic front in the near future? Let us know in the comments below. If you liked our content, hit subscribe and share. Stay tuned for more.